Okay, so I wanted to talk about this article that I came across. Most young men are single, most young women are not. I'm sure some of you may have already heard the stats or read this article. Um, but the Pew Research Center came out with this profile on single Americans. So here it is, profile on single Americans. But I think as time goes by, this is going to become a much bigger issue. As I stated here, men ages 18 to 29 are already at 63%. In women, they're only 34%. It is a huge discrepancy. Now, it also says the singles are split between being on and off of the dating market. So partnered people take up a huge chunk. The single people is around 30%, but 15% are looking and 15% are not looking. So of your single group, already half of them aren't even looking for a relationship. So The Hill covered this. Men in their 20s are more likely than women in their 20s to be romantically uninvolved, sexually dormant, friendless, and lonely. They stand at the vanguard of the epidemic in declining marriage, sexuality, and relationships that afflict all young America. Um, Goes on to say, in the worst case scenario, the young American man social disconnect can have tragic consequences. Young men commit suicide at 4 times the rate of young women. Younger men are largely responsible for rising rates of mass shootings, a trend some researchers link to the growing social isolation. Again, this is not good, being as lonely as we are. Young women are also dating and marrying slightly older men, carrying on a tradition that stretches back more than a century. The average age at first marriage is around 30 for men and 28 for women, according to the census. And this is in lockstep and barrel with hypergamy, which is typically women will date at their status level or above, whereas men will date at their status level and below. Goes on to say, men are less naturally relational than women, said Richard Reeves, a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, whose new book of Boys and Men has drawn wide praise. Now, I've heard of Richard Reeves before. I've never read his book, but there was a video I came across that he created, and it's called The Fall of Men. And so I figured, why not check it out all together?
A number of people warned me against writing a book about boys and men because it's such a fraught subject, particularly in politics right now, and because so many people were afraid that merely drawing attention to the problems of boys and men was implying somehow less effort being paid to girls and women, that it's framed as zero sum, and it's sort of a whose side are you on question, and you have to be on one side or the other rather than just being on the side of human flourishing. One of the real challenges here is that if there are men missing from certain crucial areas of our society and our economy, that makes it harder for other men and boys to flourish in those areas. We have an education system that has a dearth of male teachers. We have a labour market where the jobs that are growing fastest are ones where we have the fewest men. And in families, there's the growth in what you might call the dad deficit or fatherlessness. As men are struggling in each of those areas, what you'll see is it'll be harder for other men to follow in their footsteps. It's harder for boys to flourish if their fathers aren't engaged. It's harder for men to enter occupations where there aren't men. It's harder for boys to do well at school where there are no male teachers to be seen. And so there's a very real danger that unless we act quite soon, that we will set in train something of a vicious cycle. I'm Richard Reeves. I'm a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. And my latest book is Of Boys and Men, Why the Modern Male is Struggling, Why That Matters, and What to Do About it.
So I just wanted to pause it quickly because I think he's made already some really good points in terms of a lot of people in today's society, if you talk about uplifting men, right away they think that what you're trying to do is bring down women, which I think is the big problem in terms of way of looking at it. I think we need to continue doing what we are doing for women, but we've kind of let men fall to the wayside, and we need to bring them back up to a good level. And that doesn't mean bringing women down. It just means giving more support, talking more about men, as you said, having more male role models. A lot of my teachers growing up, I saw a lot more male teachers then than I do now. And there's so many jobs that are now dominated by women, which is fantastic. They're getting educated, they're able to get into the workforce. It's fantastic. But then, with quotas and equality and this and that, you just start stripping more and more and more away from the men and causing this imbalance. But I'll let him talk about it.
The overall picture is that on almost every measure, at almost every age, and in almost every advanced economy in the world, the girls are leaving the boys way behind, and the women leaving the men. What nobody expected was that girls and women wouldn't just catch up to boys and men in education, but would blow right past them and keep going. Everyone was very focused, quite rightly, on getting to gender equality, getting to gender parity. It's not that long ago where there was a huge gender gap the other way, and there was huge focus, correctly, in the 70s and 80s to really promote women and girls in education. But the line just kept going, and nobody predicted that. Nobody was saying, what if gender inequality re-emerges in just as big a way as now, in some cases bigger, but the other way around? And to some extent, everyone's still trying to get their head around this new world where, at least in education, when you talk about gender inequality, you're pretty much always talking about the ways in which girls and women are ahead of boys and men. And that's happened in a very, very short period of human history. So if you look at the US, for example, in the average school district in the US, girls are almost a grade level ahead of boys in English and have caught up in math. If we look at those with the highest GPA scores, the top 10%, 2/3 of those are girls. If we look at those at the bottom, 2/3 of those are boys. When it comes to going to college, there's a 10% gap in college enrollment, a similar sized gap in completing college, conditional on enrolling. And the result of those trends is that the gender gap in getting a college degree is now wider than it was in 1972, but the other way around.
Now, just think of that. Think about how crazy that is. And, this has been talked about already, how there's a lot less men that are either going to school or sticking with school, or they're dropping out of school. And then you have men who then end up going into more, I guess, labor intensive jobs or not as well paying jobs. Whereas now women are flourishing and getting to these higher positioned jobs, making a lot more money. And again, because of what I think is hypergamy, where they date their own level and above, a lot of these women don't want to date men who are either below them intellectually in terms of schooling and stuff, financially. And so a lot of these women are going to start going over for a lot of these higher status men. And then all these lower status men are just not getting picked. And this loneliness then, I think, is just getting exponentially bigger due to that.
So in 1972, when Title IX was passed to promote more gender equality in education, there was a 13 percentage point gap in favor of men getting college degrees. Now there's a 15 percentage point gap in favor of women getting college degrees. So the gender inequality we see in college today is wider than it was 50 years ago. It's just the other way around. There's quite a fierce debate about the differences between male and female brains, and in adulthood, I think there's not much evidence that the brains are that different in ways that we should worry about or that are particularly consequential. But where there's no real debate is in the timing of brain development. It is quite clear that girls' brains develop more quickly than boys' brains do, and that the biggest difference seems to occur in adolescence. So what happens is in adolescence, we develop what neuroscientists call the prefrontal cortex. The prefrontal cortex of our brain is sometimes known as the CEO of the brain. It's the bit of your brain that says you should do your chemistry homework rather than going out to party. It's the bit of your brain that says it is worth maintaining a high GPA because it will help you get to college, which might help you in the future. And that bit of the brain develops considerably earlier in girls than in boys, between 1 and 2 years earlier, partly because girls go into puberty a bit earlier than boys, and that seems to trigger some of this development. What that means is that if you have an education system that rewards the ability to turn in homework, stay on task, worry about your GPA, prepare for college and so on, then just structurally, that's going to put at an advantage the group whose brains have developed earlier in those particular areas. And that turns out on average to be girls. I think it's a great irony of women's progress that by taking the brakes off women's educational opportunities and aspirations, we've revealed the fact that the education system is slightly structured against boys and men because of these differences in the timing of brain development. But it took the women's movement to show that, because the natural advantages of women in education were impossible to see when women's aspirations were being capped by a sexist society. Now that those caps have been largely removed, we can see that it's boys and men who are at a disadvantage in the education system. At the risk of sounding boring, let's collect the data first so we know what we're dealing with here. I do think that we should be strongly encouraging boys to start school a year later than girls. I think that should become the default in many school districts because of the developmental gap that there is between boys and girls. Because boys' brains mature more slowly, then them starting school a year later would mean that they were developmentally closer to being peers with the girls in the classroom. We need a lot more male teachers. It's striking that the teaching profession has become steadily more female over time. Only 24% of K-12 teachers now are male. That's down from 33% in the 80s. And fewer men are applying to teacher training year on year. And so we've seen this steady shift towards a close to an all-female environment. That has all kinds of consequences for the ethos of the school, for the way we deal with different kinds of behavior among boys and girls, for example. And so we need a very serious and intentional effort to get more men into teaching. The third thing I would do in this world where I have significant power to dictate policies would be significantly more investment in vocational education and training. That is an area where we do seem to see better results for boys and men on average, and one that's woefully underinvested in the US. The US has really bet most of its dollars on a very academic, a very narrow route towards success, and less emphasis on vocational training. And that has actually put boys and men at a disadvantage. So apprenticeships, technical high schools, are actually a really good way to help more boys and men.
And this is another thing that we start to see problems with there's like a huge call now for more people to get into the trades, because as a lot more people strive to have like office jobs and, become CEOs or higher ups or managers or stuff like that, a lot of these labor intensive jobs or these lower level jobs kind of go to all these men who either don't have education or have a lower education, and then they're the ones who are doing all the labor force. But again, then as I said, it's looked down upon. Like a woman who's an maybe a manager or really high in a corporation, does she want to date a construction worker? Probably not. She'll go for another CEO or maybe another higher manager. And then the guys who are construction workers or plumbers or mechanics, like their pool of women is a lot smaller. But there needs to be a bigger focus now, because a lot of men are not even going into these traits, because again, they're looking at it like, well, this is look like a job that nobody respects kind of thing, But then we're going to start to see issues in society where we don't have people that can build things, that can, engineer things, that can put things together. So I definitely agree that we need to focus a little bit more on this stuff.
I think one of the challenges with this debate is that if you're talking to women and men who are, say, at the top of the economic ladder, 4-year college degrees, decent incomes, They look around and they don't see some of these issues. But that's not the same for working class men. That's not the same for men lower down the economic ladder. So there's a danger that we're so busy, to borrow Sheryl Sandberg's phrase, so busy leaning in that we don't look down. The reality for men further down the ladder is very different. The economic trends for men have turned downwards along 4 dimensions. One is wages. Most men today earn less than most men did in 1979. In employment, with a drop in labour force participation of 8 percentage points, which means 9 million men now of prime age are not working. We've seen a drop in occupational stature, and so there are now more men working in employment areas which are seen as lower status than they were in the past. And we've also seen a drop in the acquisition of skills, the kinds of skills and education that boys and men need. If boys don't get educated and men don't get skilled, they will struggle in the labour market. And across all of those domains, we've seen a downwards turn for men in the last 4 or 5 decades. And so the way in which social class divides have opened up, economic inequality has widened, is really important to understand in the context of gender inequality. If we only focus on gender gaps, then we miss the fact that both men and women at the top have done increasingly well, but that's much less true of everybody else, and especially it's less true of those from lower income backgrounds, working class boys and men, and black boys and men. You see many of those trends are amplified, and so those boys and men are really at the sharpest end of many of the social and economic changes. On the one hand, we have a huge and successful and laudable effort to get more women into STEM jobs, so science, technology, engineering, and math. On the other side, we have what I call HEAL jobs. So that's health, education, administration, and literacy, almost, if you like, the opposite side of the coin to STEM jobs. And that's where a lot of the jobs are coming from. Health and education alone are huge and growing sectors in the US. And so by my estimates, for every 1 job we're going to create in STEM between now and 2030, we're going to create 3 in HEAL jobs. But those jobs are at least as gender segregated as STEM jobs, but in the other direction. And
Yeah, I would agree. If you're thinking of, nurses and stuff like that, even for me when I was in massage, I think it was 1 man for every 8 women. And in a class where we began our year, I think we had about 45 to 50 students. There was like 7 dudes, and the rest were females. And then at the end of the year, half of us dropped out. Then there was even less men. There was about probably 5 or 6, still outnumbered by all the women. By the end of the year, I think we had maybe 3 guys who graduated, and the rest of the class was women. So yeah, I can definitely see a lot of these health oriented, outside of like maybe physically like personal trainers and stuff like that. I'd say more men are into that, but yeah, you need to have more, male nurses and all that kind of stuff.
unlike STEM, becoming more so over time. So if you look at the HEAL sector, only 24% of the workers in those sectors are male, and that number is falling. And in particular sectors, we're seeing a really precipitous drop in the number of men. We have a drop in the number of male teachers. We have a very sharp drop in the number of male psychologists. That's dropped from 39% male to 29% male in the last decade alone. And among psychologists under the age of 30, only 5% are male. So we roll that forward, and we're going to see psychology becoming essentially almost an all-female profession. So these jobs, which are both crucial, I think, for society, and where it'd be very useful to have more diversity, are actually becoming more gender segregated. And so we have absolutely no effort to get more men into HEAL jobs, which is where I think the future lies and where we should be helping men to move.
Huh, interesting.
One of the problems that we face is what I call in the book a dad deficit.
This is true too, yeah.
And that can be seen in various different ways. So 1 in 4 fathers don't live with their children. If parents split up, they're much more likely to lose contact with their fathers and with their mothers. And so 1 in 3 children, if their parents split up, don't see their father at all after a few years post the separation. So this fatherlessness is something that's very, very specific And when 4 in 10 children are born outside marriage, and most children to less educated parents are born outside marriage, then we have to reinvent what it means to be a father. Because right now, men are still being held to an old standard of what it meant to be a successful father in a world where that is neither possible for many of them or even desirable. Because what we've seen is, as women have grown in economic power and economic independence, then of course they're going to choose to be with a man rather than being forced to, as in the old days. This is probably...
And I think this is a great point that he's putting out about how women have the ability to choose now. Especially on dating apps, I think they said like for every one woman, there's 3 men. So there's a lot more men who are on these dating apps, but with a smaller pool of women to choose from. Whereas these women have such a large pool to choose from, but they're only choosing the top, 10% of those men on the apps. So you have all these women trying to get with the same amount of men. And now you have all these other men who are then trying to fight for these women's attention. And, and these women can choose men with higher status, men with, more financial stability. They don't need to just settle for, a guy now. But, and then on the flip side, these women are also starting to get married a lot later, have kids a lot later. If they do date or marry, it's typically older men, so they're not even dating within their age range. And this all has trickle down effects. So it's a good point that he's putting out here.
Choose to be with a man rather than being forced to, as in the old days. This is probably the greatest liberation in human history, honestly, that women can now choose whether to be with a man or not. More than 2 out of 5 households in the US now, a woman is the main breadwinner. 40% of American women earn more than the average man. These are huge economic changes and all for the good, but it does pose some really sharp questions about what fathers are for. And until we escape the obsolete model of the breadwinner father, then we will continue to see more and more men being left out of family life. And the kicker is that boys in families that don't have a father presence suffer much more than girls. And so then what happens is that male disadvantage can become intergenerational, because if the fathers are struggling and therefore not really involved in their kids' lives, then the boys are the ones who suffer most, who will then go on to struggle themselves in education and the labor market.
It's crazy, and that's also another good point, is that a lot of men who typically were the breadwinners, did make the money, all that, et cetera, that kind of gave them a purpose, a meaning, they had that responsibility to go above and beyond to do that for their family. And today's day and age, it's kind of hard to have a single income family. So yeah, there are going to be a lot more people who do dual incomes, but if the woman is making more, then the man's kind of well, what am I good for? Right?
It's clear by now that marriage and social institutions and a sense of purpose matter to men. And so as we've seen these real challenges faced by men in education, work, and family, you're seeing some really difficult and troubling health consequences. And so the so-called deaths of despair from suicide, overdose, or alcohol, 3 times higher among men than among women. Suicide itself, 3 times higher among men and women, and rising very quickly, especially among middle-aged men and younger men. So we can see these as symptoms, I think, of a broader malaise, which is what's troubling boys and men. And for men in particular, this sense of purpose is very important. I think it's a human universal that we need to be needed. There's a wonderful piece of work by an academic called Fiona Shand, who looked at the last words that men had used to describe themselves before committing suicide or attempting suicide. And the top of the list were worthless and useless. I think if we create a society in which so many men do feel like they're not needed, then it's no surprise that we see these deaths of despair, we see problems with opioids. Opioids are a much bigger problem for men than they are for women. And one of the great tragedies of opioid deaths is the death rates are higher in part because the users are on their own. And so in some ways, the opioid epidemic is a perfect illustration of a whole series of things we're talking about, which is a loss of role in the family, a loss of status in the labor market, turning to drugs, and being isolated and withdrawn. And so in that example, I think you can see a symptom of this broader male malaise that we just need to take it more seriously. And we have a cultural responsibility as a society, men and women together, to help men and boys to adjust to this new world. Because right now, many of them are really struggling.
Get smarter, faster with videos from the world's big.
That's crazy. That's a fantastic video. Highly recommend everybody spread it. Thanks so much for making that video. But yeah, I think a lot of these things, as you stated, tie into this extreme loneliness that a lot of these boys and men are starting to battle with. And yeah, hopefully we start to see a change in this, because these numbers are staggering, where it's 63% to 34%. But anyways, as always, you guys let me know in the comment section below what you guys thought about this one. A little bit longer of a video, but hope you guys enjoyed it, and I will catch you guys on the next one.